Kamala had always been the type of person who carried herself with an effortless grace, a quality that made her stand out no matter where she went. At 41, she exuded a confident maturity, her Colombian roots shining through in her radiant smile, and the warmth in her deep brown eyes. People often told her she had a captivating presence, the kind that left an impression even in fleeting encounters. But as she pulled her car into the driveway on that bright, breezy afternoon, all of that grace seemed to vanish in an instant. The day had already felt slightly off kilter, and she could sense that it was about to get worse. Balancing grocery bags in both hands, she climbed out of her car with the precision of a tightrope walker, the plastic handles cutting into her fingers as she tried to manage the weight of an overambitious shopping trip. Her floral dress fluttered lightly in the wind, a teasing reminder of her decision to forgo certain undergarments for comfort that morning. She chuckled to herself at the thought, shaking her head as she approached the front door. As she reached for the doorknob, the realization hit her like a cold splash of water. Her keys weren't in her hand. Panic flickered in her chest, but she dismissed it quickly. Surely they were somewhere in her purse. Setting one of the bags down on the step, Kamala began rummaging through her large leather handbag with the kind of surgical precision that only years of experience could bring. Lipstick? Check. Wallet? Check. Sunglasses? Of course, but keys? Nowhere to be found. The more she searched, the more frantic her movements became, her fingers diving into every pocket and corner of the bag. She even shook it upside down in desperation, half hoping the keys would magically tumble out. They didn't. She let out a heavy sigh, muttering a soft curse in Spanish under her breath. Today wasn't supposed to be like this. It had started out as a promising day. She'd gotten up early, tackled her errands, and even treated herself to a coffee and a pastry at her favorite cafe. Now, here she was, stranded outside her own house with groceries that were slowly warming in the afternoon sun. Kamala glanced around, as if the universe might provide a solution if she looked hard enough. The front door was clearly out of the question, and her keys were definitely not on her person. After a moment of contemplation, she decided to try her luck at the back entrance. Picking up the second grocery bag, she carefully maneuvered her way around the side of the house, doing her best to avoid stepping on the freshly cut grass. Her sandals left faint imprints in the soil, and she couldn't help but mutter again as a rogue blade of grass stuck stubbornly to her ankle. As she rounded the corner into the backyard, she was greeted by a familiar sight that momentarily lifted her spirits. Max, her exuberant golden Labrador, came bounding toward her with the unrestrained joy that only a dog could muster. His tail wagged furiously, a blur of movement that seemed almost comical. "Max!" Kamala exclaimed, dropping the bags unceremoniously as she crouched to greet him. The dog barked happily, his wet nose pressing against her cheek as he licked her face with enthusiasm. "You always know how to make me smile, don't you, amiga?" She ruffled his fur, laughing despite her predicament. For a brief moment, the stress of the forgotten keys melted away in the warmth of Max's affection. But the reprieve was short-lived. As Max slipped effortlessly through the small pet door into the house, Kamala's eyes followed him, and an idea began to form. If Max could get in through the pet door, maybe she could too. It wasn't the most dignified plan, but desperate times called for desperate measures. Placing the grocery bags down near the door, she crouched to examine the small opening. It didn't look that small, she reasoned, leaning forward to gauge its size. First, she slid the grocery bags through the door, watching them tumble onto the kitchen floor inside. Then she knelt and prepared to follow. The cool breeze against her skin was a stark contrast to the determination on her face as she positioned herself in front of the pet door. However, as soon as she tried to push her shoulders through, it became painfully obvious that her plan was flawed. The opening was far too narrow. She leaned back, resting on her knees, and let out a frustrated laugh. Of course, it had to be one of those days, the kind where nothing seemed to go right. She leaned against the wall of the house, catching her breath as she mulled over her next move. The thought of calling for help briefly crossed her mind, but the idea of explaining the situation to anyone felt too embarrassing to entertain. She could already picture the conversation. "Yes, hi, I'm locked out of my house, and no, I don't have a spare key. Oh, and by the way, I just tried to crawl through my pet door." No, she decided, she'd have to figure this out on her own. That's when her gaze landed on the basement window. It was slightly wider than the pet door, and while it wasn't an ideal solution, it seemed like her best bet. Gathering her resolve, she made her way to the side of the house, where the window sat just a few feet off the ground. The sight of it gave her a flicker of hope. If she could just wiggle through, she'd be inside in no time. Kamala knelt in front of the window, brushing a strand of hair out of her face as she inspected the frame. It looked sturdy but not impossible to navigate. With a determined huff, she pushed the window open, feeling the cool air from inside the basement rush out to meet her. For a moment she hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. The last thing she needed was an audience. Satisfied that she was alone, Kamala placed her hands on the windowsill and began to hoist herself up. The movement was awkward, and her dress caught slightly on the edge as she tried to maneuver her body through the narrow opening. She paused halfway, taking a moment to catch her breath. From this angle, the absurdity of the situation hit her all at once. Here she was, stuck halfway in a basement window, her floral dress fluttering in the breeze, and her dog happily wagging his tail nearby, completely oblivious to her struggle. If anyone were to see her now, she thought, it would make quite the spectacle. The image of her neighbor catching her in this compromising position made her cheeks flush with a mix of embarrassment and humor. But there was no turning back now. Kamala steeled herself and prepared to push the rest of the way through, completely unaware that her day was about to take yet another unexpected turn. Kamala crouched on the front step, her hands sifting through her oversized purse as if it were a black hole swallowing all her essentials. Her grocery bags, now sitting precariously on the uneven surface, seemed to mock her predicament. She felt a wave of frustration rising as the keys remained stubbornly elusive, her fingers grazing every item except the one she needed. The early afternoon sun beat down relentlessly, turning the moment into a metaphorical spotlight on her predicament, and Kamala couldn't help but let out a soft growl of annoyance. Seriously, of all the days, she muttered under her breath, her voice carrying a hint of disbelief. It wasn't the first time she'd misplaced something important, but it was always at the worst possible moment. She paused to gather herself, taking a deep breath and glancing at the grocery bags. Their contents, vegetables, bread, and a bottle of wine, were slowly warming, an unspoken reminder of the clock ticking against her. Reluctantly, she picked up the bags and stood, her mind racing through a mental inventory of possibilities. Maybe she'd left the keys in the car? No, she distinctly remembered grabbing them when she'd left the store. Could they have fallen somewhere on the walk to the door? That seemed unlikely, but she scanned the ground just in case, her sharp eyes skimming over the driveway. Nothing. Her frustration deepened as she replayed the morning in her head. She'd been so careful today, juggling a million small errands, and still managing to keep her head above water. And now this, locked out of her own house. She almost laughed at the irony but stopped herself, biting her lip instead. This was not how she wanted to end her day. Turning her attention to the house, Kamala decided to try the backyard. It wasn't an ideal solution, but she remembered the back door had a tendency to stick rather than lock completely. If she was lucky, she could wiggle it open. Balancing the bags once more, she began the trek around the side of the house, stepping carefully to avoid the freshly watered grass. Each step squished slightly under her sandals, adding to the sensory irritation of an already frustrating situation. As she rounded the corner, the backyard came into view, and with it, the sight of her golden Labrador, Max, lying in the shade. His ears perked up as he spotted her, and in an instant, he was bounding toward her with unrestrained enthusiasm. His tail wagged furiously, a blur of movement that seemed entirely out of place with her sour mood. "Max," Kamala said with a sigh, unable to suppress a small smile despite herself. She set the bags down, knelt to greet him, scratching behind his ears as he barked excitedly. "Well, at least someone's having a good day." Max, oblivious to her troubles, spun in circles before darting toward the small pet door at the base of the back entrance. In one fluid motion, he slipped through it, his tail disappearing inside as the flap swung shut behind him. Kamala watched him with a mix of amusement and envy, her mind suddenly latching onto the tiny door as a potential solution. If Max could get inside, why couldn't she? The idea was ridiculous, of course. The pet door was small, designed for a 70-pound Labrador, not a fully grown woman. But Kamala was desperate, and desperation had a way of making even the silliest ideas seem plausible. She approached the door, crouching to inspect it more closely. It didn't look that small, she reasoned. Surely, with the right angle and a little determination, she could fit through. First, She slid the grocery bags through the opening, their weight landing with a dull thud on the tile floor inside. That part, at least, was easy enough. Next came the hard part. Kamala knelt on the ground, positioning herself carefully in front of the door. She placed her hands on either side of the frame, steadying herself as she prepared to push through. The cool breeze from inside the house brushed against her face as she leaned forward, her shoulders angling to fit through the narrow opening. But as soon as she tried to slide further, reality hit her like a wall. The pet door was far too small, her shoulders catching on the frame and refusing to budge. She twisted slightly, trying a different angle, but it was no use. The door wasn't designed for a human, no matter how determined she was. Leaning back, Kamala let out a frustrated laugh, brushing a strand of hair from her face as she sat back on her knees. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on her. Here she was, crouched on the ground like a would-be cat burglar, trying to break into her own house through a dog door. She could only imagine what her neighbors would think if they saw her now. "All right, that's not happening," she muttered, shaking her head as she stood and brushed off her dress. The pet door might have been a clever idea, but it was time to face facts. She needed another solution. Her eyes wandered across the yard, scanning for other possibilities. The windows were too high to reach without a ladder, and the front door was still securely locked. That left only one option: the basement window. It wasn't ideal. It faced her neighbor's house, which meant there was a higher chance of being seen, but it was wide enough to fit through. At least she hoped it was. Kamala made her way to the side of the house, her steps purposeful as she approached the small window. It sat just a few feet off the ground, its frame slightly ajar from the last time she'd aired out the basement. Bending down, she inspected it closely, noting the chipped paint around the edges and the faint streaks of dirt on the glass. It didn't look particularly inviting, but at this point she wasn't in a position to be picky. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the window open further, the hinges creaking slightly in protest. Cool air wafted out, carrying with it the faint smell of damp concrete and storage boxes. Kamala hesitated for a moment, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. The last thing she needed was an audience for what was shaping up to be the most embarrassing moment of her day. Satisfied that she was alone, she placed her hands on the windowsill and began to hoist herself up. The movement was awkward, her dress catching slightly on the rough edge as she tried to maneuver her legs through the opening. She paused halfway, balancing precariously as she tried to angle her body just right. The frame pressed uncomfortably against her sides, a reminder that the window was barely wide enough to accommodate her. For a brief moment, Kamala considered abandoning the attempt altogether. The thought of being caught halfway through a window, her legs dangling awkwardly outside, was enough to make her cheeks flush with embarrassment. But she was too far gone to turn back now. With a determined grunt, she pushed forward, inching her way through the narrow opening. The whole time, a nagging thought lingered at the back of her mind. If this didn't work, she had no idea what she would do next. Kamala gritted her teeth as she wriggled her shoulders through the narrow basement window, the cool metal frame pressing against her skin. It had seemed like a clever idea a few minutes ago, but now, halfway through the opening with her torso stuck and her legs dangling awkwardly outside, the reality of her predicament began to set in. The faint, damp smell of the basement wafted up to her, mingling with the fresh scent of the grass outside. She sighed, resting her forehead against the window frame for a moment to collect her thoughts. The situation was undeniably absurd, and yet, she couldn't see a way out that didn't involve a good deal of embarrassment or physical effort. The first problem was her dress, which had bunched up around her hips during the attempt. The light fabric fluttered in the breeze, leaving her feeling far more exposed than she cared to admit. She shifted uncomfortably, trying to tug it down with one hand while bracing herself against the frame with the other. The awkward angle made the task nearly impossible, and she muttered a soft curse under her breath as the fabric stubbornly refused to cooperate. If anyone were to see her now, it would undoubtedly be the most humiliating moment of her life. As if on cue, a faint rustling sound reached her ears. She froze, her heart skipping a beat as she strained to listen. Was it the wind, or was someone nearby? Slowly, she turned her head to glance over her shoulder, but her limited range of motion made it difficult to see much of anything. The backyard appeared empty, save for Max, who sat a few feet away, his head cocked to one side in apparent confusion. His tail wagged slowly, as if he were debating whether this strange scene was some new game he was supposed to join. "Max, go inside," Kamala whispered urgently, though she knew the command was futile. The dog tilted his head further, his expressive brown eyes filled with curiosity. She could almost hear his thoughts. "What on earth are you doing, human?" "Of course you're no help," she muttered, turning her attention back to the window. She gave another experimental push, trying to inch herself further inside. The rough edges of the frame scraped against her sides, and she winced, biting her lip to keep from crying out. The effort felt fruitless. She was firmly wedged in place, her body stubbornly refusing to move in either direction. A sudden noise from behind made her stomach lurch. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps on grass, faint but deliberate. Panic bubbled up inside her as she realized that someone was approaching. She couldn't tell how close they were, but the idea of being caught in such an awkward position sent a surge of heat rushing to her cheeks. Her mind raced through possible explanations, none of which seemed remotely convincing. How could she explain this without sounding utterly ridiculous? "Hello?" A voice called out, deep and slightly amused. Kamala's stomach dropped. She recognized the voice immediately. It was Jay, her 19-year-old neighbor. Of all the people who could have stumbled upon her, it had to be him. She groaned inwardly, closing her eyes for a brief moment, as if to will the situation away. But the sound of his footsteps growing closer reminded her that there was no escaping this. "Kamala?" Jay called again, his tone tinged with both concern and curiosity. "Is that you?" "Yes, it's me," she replied reluctantly, her voice muffled by her position. She kept her head down, unwilling to meet his gaze. I seem to have gotten myself into a bit of a situation." Jay's laugh was soft but unmistakable. "Yeah, I can see that. Need some help?" "No, I've got it under control," she said quickly, though it was painfully clear that she did not. Her pride refused to let her admit just how badly she needed assistance, especially to someone who was barely out of his teens. Jay didn't seem convinced. "You're stuck, aren't you?" he asked, his tone teasing. Kamala groaned, pressing her forehead against the window frame. Maybe, she admitted grudgingly, "but I don't need an audience, so if you could just—" "Too late for that," he interrupted, and she could hear the grin in his voice. "I've already got the best seat in the house." The implication of his words hit her like a ton of bricks. With her legs and lower body still outside the window, she realized just how vulnerable her position was. Her cheeks burned as she imagined what he might be seeing. "Jay, I swear if you—" "Relax," he said, cutting her off with a chuckle. "I'm just kidding. Let me see if I can help you out." Kamala sighed, her irritation mounting. She could hear him stepping closer, his movements deliberate. She felt his presence behind her, and the proximity only heightened her embarrassment. "Please just don't make this any worse than it already is," she muttered. All right, he said, his tone light but reassuring. "Let's see what we're dealing with here." She felt his hand brush against her arm as he tried to find a good grip. The touch startled her, and she flinched slightly, twisting instinctively. The sudden movement only worsened her predicament, and she let out an exasperated sigh. "Be careful," she snapped, her frustration boiling over. "Hey, I'm doing my best here," Jay replied, though his voice carried a hint of amusement. "You're the one who decided to crawl through a window. Do you have a better idea?" she shot back, her tone sharp. Jay didn't answer immediately, and she could feel him pause, as if weighing his options. After a moment, he said, "Maybe if I lift you a bit, you can slide the rest of the way in?" Kamala hesitated, her pride warring with her desire to be free of the situation. Finally, she relented. "Fine. Just make it quick." Jay's hands moved to her waist and Kamala tensed instinctively. "All right, on three," he said. 1, 2. Before he could finish, a sharp bark interrupted them. Max had decided to join the commotion, his sudden excitement adding a new layer of chaos to the scene. The dog darted toward them, his tail wagging furiously as he barked again, clearly eager to participate in whatever was happening. "Max, no!" Kamala cried, but it was too late. The Labrador's enthusiasm knew no bounds, and in his excitement he jumped up, his cold nose pressing against the back of her leg. The unexpected sensation made her yelp, and she squirmed reflexively, her movements sending her further into the window frame. Jay let out a startled laugh, struggling to keep his grip as the chaos unfolded. "Okay, this is officially the weirdest thing I've ever done," he said, his voice strained with effort. "Just get me out of here," Kamala shouted, her tone a mix of desperation and exasperation. After what felt like an eternity of awkward maneuvering, Jay managed to free her. She tumbled forward, landing unceremoniously on the basement floor in a heap. For a moment she lay there, catching her breath and trying to process the sheer absurdity of what had just happened. When she finally sat up, she turned to see Jay leaning against the windowsill, grinning down at her. "You know," he said, his tone playful, "if you wanted to make an impression, there are easier ways." Kamala glared at him, her cheeks still flushed. "Don't you dare say another word," she warned. Jay held up his hands in mock surrender, his grin widening. All right, but you have to admit, that was pretty funny." Kamala didn't respond. Instead, brushing herself off as she stood, she turned to Max, who wagged his tail innocently as if none of this was his fault. "You and I are going to have a serious talk later," she muttered, pointing a finger at the dog. Jay laughed again, and despite herself, Kamala felt the corners of her mouth twitch upward. As much as she hated to admit it, there was something undeniably ridiculous and memorable about the entire ordeal. Kamala remained uncomfortably wedged in the basement window, her arms braced against the sill as she tried to decide her next move. Her situation was already ridiculous, but the arrival of her neighbor Jay had transformed it into a full-blown nightmare. She could hear him standing just a few feet behind her, the faint rustle of his clothes as he shifted his weight betraying his amusement. She didn't dare look back at him, partly because of the awkward position she was in and partly because she didn't want to see whatever expression was undoubtedly plastered on his face. "All right," Jay said, breaking the silence with a casual tone that immediately grated on her nerves. So, should I even ask how this happened?" Kamala groaned, pressing her forehead against the window frame. "No, you shouldn't," she replied sharply. "Just help me get out of here, and we'll pretend this never happened." Jay let out a low chuckle, clearly enjoying himself far more than she thought appropriate. "I don't know," he teased. "This seems like the kind of thing you'd want to remember. You don't see something like this every day." Kamala turned her head slightly, just enough to glare at him over her shoulder. "Jay, I swear, if you're taking pictures." "I'm not," he said quickly, though his grin was audible in his voice. "But now that you mention it, this would make for a pretty hilarious Instagram post." "Don't you dare," Kamala snapped, her tone sharp enough to cut through his playful demeanor. She shifted slightly, trying to free herself, but the movement only made the situation worse. The window frame pressed harder against her sides, and she let out a frustrated sigh. "Just stop joking around and help me, okay?" All right, Jay said, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "Let's see what we're working with here." Kamala felt his presence draw closer, the warmth of his proximity making her even more acutely aware of her vulnerable position. She bit her lip, her cheeks flushing as she imagined how ridiculous she must look from his perspective. Her floral dress, already bunched up around her hips, fluttered lightly in the breeze, and her legs, still outside the window, dangled uselessly above the ground. It was, without a doubt, the most humiliating moment of her life. Jay crouched down beside her, his head level with the window. "Okay," he said, his tone suddenly more serious as he assessed the situation. "You're really stuck in there?" "Huh? No, I'm just hanging out for fun," Kamala muttered sarcastically, rolling her eyes. "Of course I'm stuck." Jay chuckled again, the sound low and warm. "All right, no need to bite my head off. Let me see if I can figure this out." She felt his hands on the frame of the window, his fingers brushing against her arms as he tried to find a way to grip her without making things more awkward. The touch sent a jolt through her, and she tensed instinctively. "Careful," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "Relax," Jay replied, his tone soothing. "I'm just trying to help. You've got to trust me a little." Kamala let out a reluctant sigh, forcing herself to loosen up. "Fine," she said, "but if you make this worse, I won't," Jay assured her, though she could still hear the amusement in his voice. "You're in good hands." Despite her embarrassment, she couldn't help but notice how calm he seemed. For someone who had just stumbled upon such a bizarre scene, Jay was handling it remarkably well. His confidence, while slightly annoying, was oddly reassuring. Kamala closed her eyes, trying to block out her rising self-consciousness as he began to maneuver her body slightly, testing the limits of the window's frame. "All right," he said after a moment. I think if I pull while you push, we might be able to get you out. Kamala hesitated, the thought of being physically manhandled through the window not exactly appealing. But she didn't see any other options. Okay, she said finally. Just be careful. Jay nodded, his grip firm as he positioned himself to pull her free. On 3, he said. 1, 2. Before he could finish, Max decided to join the commotion. The golden Labrador bounded over, barking excitedly, as if he thought this was all some elaborate game. His tail wagged furiously, and he darted around Jay, clearly eager to help in whatever way he could. Max, no. Kamala cried, twisting slightly to look at the dog. Her sudden movement threw Jay off balance, and he stumbled backward, narrowly avoiding falling flat on his back. Ooh! Jay exclaimed, laughing as he caught himself. Your dog's got great timing. Max, sit. Kamala commanded, her voice firm. The dog hesitated for a moment before plopping down obediently, his tail still wagging. All right, Jay said, shaking his head with a grin. Let's try that again. This time no distractions. Kamala nodded, bracing herself as Jay resumed his position. He placed his hands on her sides, his grip steady but gentle. Okay, he said. Push when I pull. Ready? Ready, Kamala replied, her voice tight with determination. On his count they worked together, Kamala pushing with all her strength as Jay pulled. It was awkward and uncomfortable, but inch by inch she began to feel herself slipping free. The frame scraped against her sides, and for a moment she thought she might get stuck again. But with one final effort she tumbled forward, landing unceremoniously on the basement floor in a heap. Jay let out a triumphant laugh, leaning against the windowsill as he looked down at her. Well, he said, grinning, that was definitely a team effort. Kamala sat up slowly, brushing herself off as she tried to regain her composure. Her cheeks were still flushed, and her hair was a mess. But she was finally free. She turned to look at Jay, who was still watching her with an amused expression. Don't say it, she warned, her tone sharp. Jay held up his hands, the grin never leaving his face. I wasn't going to say anything, he said innocently. But if I were, I'd probably say something like, you're welcome. Kamala rolled her eyes, standing up and smoothing down her dress. Thank you, she said begrudgingly. But this doesn't mean I owe you anything. Of course not, Jay said, his tone mockingly sincere. Although if you wanted to bake me a pie or something, I wouldn't say no. Kamala shot him a withering look, but she couldn't help the small smile that tugged at the corners of her mouth. Just go home, Jay, she said, waving him off. Jay laughed, stepping back from the window. All right, I'll see you around, Kamala. As he walked away, Max trotted over to her, wagging his tail happily. Kamala sighed, scratching behind his ears as she looked down at him. You're lucky you're cute, she muttered. The dog barked in response, his eyes bright and cheerful. Kamala shook her head, a mixture of exasperation and amusement flickering across her face. It had been a long, strange day, and she had a feeling it wasn't over yet. Kamala sat on the cool basement floor, her back pressed against the wall as she tried to catch her breath. Her heart was still racing from the sheer ridiculousness of the ordeal, and she couldn't decide whether to laugh or cry. The scrape of the window frame against her sides lingered in her mind, a physical reminder of how absurd the whole situation had been. She brushed her hair out of her face, tucking the damp strands behind her ears, and glanced up at the open window above her. Sunlight filtered through, highlighting Jay's silhouette as he leaned casually against the frame, looking down at her with a grin that was equal parts amused and triumphant. Not bad, Jay said, his tone light and teasing. I'd say that went about as smoothly as it could have. Kamala let out a breathless laugh, shaking her head as she struggled to find her words. Smooth isn't exactly how I'd describe it, she muttered, her voice tinged with exhaustion. She leaned her head back against the wall, closing her eyes for a moment as she tried to process everything that had just happened. But thanks, I guess. You're welcome, Jay replied, his grin widening. Though if I'm being honest, I think Max deserves some of the credit. He was pretty enthusiastic about helping. Kamala opened her eyes and turned to look at the dog, who was now sitting obediently beside her, his tail wagging with unrelenting enthusiasm. Oh, he was helpful. All right, she said dryly, scratching behind Max's ears. Helpful in making this 10 times more chaotic than it needed to be. Max barked in response, as if to protest her accusation, and Kamala couldn't help but laugh. The sound was soft and genuine, a release of the tension that had been building all afternoon. For all the frustration and embarrassment, there was something undeniably comical about the whole situation. She looked up at Jay again, her smile fading slightly as a thought occurred to her. "Wait," she said, her tone suddenly sharp. "You didn't take any pictures, did you?" Jay straightened, his expression shifting from amusement to mock innocence. "Me? No way," he said, holding up his hands. "I wouldn't do that to you." Kamala narrowed her eyes, studying him closely. "You're a terrible liar, you know that." Jay sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "All right, fine," he admitted. "I might have hit record on my phone for a second, but only because it was too funny not to." "Jay!" Kamala exclaimed, her voice rising with a mix of disbelief and irritation. She pushed herself to her feet, brushing off her dress as she glared at him. "That is not okay." "Relax," Jay said quickly, pulling his phone from his pocket. "I'll delete it right now." "See?" He held the screen up for her to see as he navigated to the video and pressed delete. "Gone. No harm, no foul." Kamala folded her arms, her expression still stern. "You better hope that's the only copy," she said. "Because if I find out you've shared it with anyone—" "I won't," Jay interrupted, his tone suddenly serious. "I swear. It was just a stupid moment, and I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable." His sincerity caught Kamala off guard, and she felt her resolve soften slightly. She sighed, running a hand through her hair as she tried to let go of her frustration. "All right," she said finally. "But if you ever pull something like that again, I'm not going to be so forgiving." "Understood," Jay said, nodding earnestly. Lesson learned. For a moment there was silence between them, broken only by the soft rustle of the breeze and the distant chirping of birds. Kamala looked around the basement, her eyes falling on the scattered grocery bags she had managed to toss inside earlier. She walked over and began gathering them, stacking them neatly in one corner. Jay watched her for a moment before speaking again. "You know," he said, his voice lighter now, "for what it's worth, you handled that whole situation pretty well." Kamala snorted, glancing over her shoulder at him. "Yeah, right. Because crawling through a window and getting stuck is such a shining example of grace under pressure." "I'm serious," Jay said, his tone earnest. "Most people would have completely lost it. But you stayed calm, or, mostly calm, and figured it out. That's impressive." Kamala rolled her eyes, though she couldn't help the small smile that tugged at her lips. "Well, thanks, I guess," she said, her voice softening. Jay returned her smile, leaning his arms on the windowsill. "Anytime. And for the record, if you ever need to break into your house again, you know who to call." "Let's hope it doesn't come to that," Kamala said, shaking her head. She picked up the last bag and turned back toward him, tilting her head slightly. "But if it does, I'll keep you in mind." Jay grinned, stepping back from the window as Kamala approached. She handed him the bag through the opening, and he took it with a nod. "All right," he said. "I should probably get going. Try not to lock yourself out again, okay?" "I'll do my best," Kamala replied, her tone dry but playful. "And Jay, thanks, really. Anytime," he said, flashing her a final smile before turning to leave. "See you around, Kamala." As he walked away, Kamala watched him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. Despite everything, she had to admit that Jay had been a good sport about the whole situation. She shook her head, a small laugh escaping her lips as she turned back to Max. "You, on the other hand," she said, pointing a finger at the dog, "are officially on my list. No more helping until further notice." Max wagged his tail, his tongue lolling out in what could only be described as a doggy grin. Kamala sighed, unable to stay mad at him for long. She crouched down to give him a pat on the head before gathering the groceries and heading up the stairs to the main floor of the house. The air inside was cool and quiet, a welcome change from the chaos of the backyard. As she unpacked the groceries, Kamala found herself replaying the events of the afternoon in her mind. It had been stressful and embarrassing, yes, but it had also been strangely entertaining. Life had a funny way of throwing curveballs when you least expected them, and today had been no exception. By the time she finished, Kamala felt a sense of calm settling over her. She glanced at Max, who had curled up on the floor nearby, and smiled. "Well, buddy," she said, "we survived. Barely, but we did." Max wagged his tail in response, his eyes half closed as he settled into a contented nap. Kamala leaned against the counter, her mind wandering to the events of the day one last time. She couldn't change what had happened, but at least she could laugh about it now. And maybe, just maybe, she'd remember to keep a spare key on hand next time. As the sun began its slow descent, casting a warm golden hue across the neighborhood, Kamala stood in her kitchen, staring out the window with a mixture of disbelief and amusement. The events of the day played over in her mind like a chaotic comedy sketch, each moment more ridiculous than the last. She still couldn't quite believe how things had unfolded, from the simple mistake of leaving her keys somewhere to the absurd lengths she'd gone to just to get back into her own home. It was a day that would be hard to forget, though she wasn't sure she'd want to. The groceries were finally unpacked, their contents neatly arranged on the counter as if nothing unusual had occurred. The bottle of wine sat in the center, catching her eye. Kamala reached for it, uncorking it with a practiced hand before pouring herself a generous glass. If there was ever a day that called for a little indulgence, this was it. She leaned against the counter, swirling the wine in her glass as she allowed herself a rare moment of stillness. Her reflection in the kitchen window caught her attention, and she studied her face, searching for some sign of the chaos she'd endured. Her cheeks were still slightly flushed, her hair a little wild, but there was a glimmer of amusement in her eyes. She let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. "What a day," she murmured to herself, taking a sip of the wine. Max trotted into the kitchen, his nails clicking against the tile floor. He looked up at her with his usual eager expression, his tail wagging slowly, as if to ask whether she was finally done with her human dramas. Kamala smiled down at him, setting her glass aside to crouch and scratch behind his ears. "You are a big part of this mess, you know," she said, her tone light. "I don't think I've ever been so embarrassed in my life." Max wagged his tail harder, clearly unbothered by her words. His eyes sparkled with innocence, a silent testament to his belief that he'd done absolutely nothing wrong. Kamala laughed softly, leaning in to kiss the top of his head. "I guess I can't stay mad at you," she said. "But seriously, Max, next time maybe a little less enthusiasm?" She stood, watching as Max wandered off to settle in his usual spot by the couch. The house felt unusually quiet after the afternoon's chaos, and Kamala found herself reflecting on the unexpected series of events that had brought her to this moment. It wasn't just the physical comedy of getting stuck in a window or the mortifying realization that her neighbor had seen the whole thing. It was the sheer unpredictability of it all, the reminder that even the most mundane days could spiral into something extraordinary. Her thoughts drifted to Jay, and she couldn't help but smile despite herself. He had been irritating. Sure, his teasing had pushed every button she had, but there was no denying that he'd come through for her when it mattered. His playful demeanor and light-hearted comments had somehow made the situation less unbearable, even if they'd also added to her embarrassment. Kamala shook her head, wondering how she would face him the next time their paths crossed. The memory of his grin lingered in her mind, along with his sincere apology for recording the moment. That had surprised her, the way he'd seemed genuinely remorseful despite his earlier antics. It wasn't something she'd expected from a teenager barely out of high school, and it made her wonder if she'd misjudged him a little. For all his teasing, Jay had shown kindness and maturity when it counted. She supposed she could give him credit for that. As the room grew dimmer with the fading light, Kamala moved to the couch, her glass of wine in hand. Max lifted his head briefly to acknowledge her before settling back down with a contented sigh. She sat down and curled her legs beneath her, letting herself sink into the cushions. The wine was smooth and warm, its rich flavor a welcome contrast to the day's chaos. She sipped it slowly, savoring the quiet and allowing her thoughts to wander. The absurdity of the situation struck her again, and she laughed softly, the sound echoing in the empty room. It wasn't just that she'd gotten stuck in a window, it was everything about the moment. The way she'd convinced herself she could fit through the pet door. The sight of Max watching her with what could only be described as amused curiosity. The arrival of Jay, his playful smirk and teasing comments making her want to disappear and laugh all at once. It was a story she'd have to tell someday, though she wasn't sure how much she'd be able to share without dying of embarrassment. Still, as ridiculous as it had been, there was something almost endearing about the whole experience. It reminded her of how unpredictable life could be, how even the simplest days could turn into something memorable. Kamala had always prided herself on being organized and put together, but today had been a humbling reminder that even she wasn't immune to life's little curveballs. She leaned back against the cushions, staring up at the ceiling as a slow smile spread across her face. For all the embarrassment, there was a part of her that was grateful for the experience. It had broken up the monotony of her routine, given her a story she'd carry with her for years. And in a strange way, it had brought her closer to the people and the dog around her. Jay might still be an irritating neighbor, but she couldn't deny that he'd proven himself to be a good person at heart. And Max, for all his mischief, remained her constant companion, his boundless energy and unwavering loyalty never failing to bring a smile to her face. Kamala sighed, setting her glass down on the coffee table as she let her eyes drift shut. The house was quiet now, the kind of stillness that only came after a long, eventful day. She felt a sense of peace settle over her, a calm she hadn't expected to find after everything that had happened. It was a reminder, she thought, that even the craziest days could end on a quiet, satisfying note. As she drifted off to sleep, Max curled up beside her, his warm presence a comforting weight against her side. Kamala's last thought before she slipped into dreams was a simple one. Life was messy, unpredictable, and often ridiculous. But it was also full of moments that made it all worthwhile. Today had been a perfect example of that, and for all its ups and downs, she wouldn't trade it for anything.